Good morning. My name is Sam. I am an alcoholic and I'm also a son of recovery. Let's start out with the Serenity Prayer. Good and gracious God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. So I'm reading through 12 Secular Steps by Bill W., and I'm in chapter 3, which is Characteristics of Addiction and of Addicts. So I'm going to finish out chapter 3 today. Childhood risk factors for addiction, early use, and toxic home environments. A child that isn't preparing a young person. A childhood that isn't preparing a young person for life is likely priming them for addiction. Growing up in dysfunctional, chaotic, violent, or neglectful homes puts children at greatly increased risk. For instance, through the initial use of alcohol or drugs, many of us discover, at last, a coping mechanism that seems adequate to deal with the damage and pain caused by our dismal circumstances. Unfortunately, self-medication under these conditions often accelerates our progression through addiction's phases, sometimes at a profoundly rapid rate. Another factor to consider is that many of us began using drugs and alcohol well before our childhood was complete. Early drug use significantly interferes with physical development of the brain from birth on up through our early 20s. And remember, these physical changes and remodeling of the brain not only increase the risk of addiction, they also remain partially irreversible. In dysfunctional homes, children are often not taught sufficient social problem solving and coping skills. If we then add to these deficiencies early drug use, it's easy to see that social, emotional, and cognitive maturity will fall quite short of the norms we need later to be successful in life. Rehab counselors often say that addicts remain emotionally stuck at the age at which they started using. Another observation I've made over the years is that once addiction has formed, those of us who grew up in dysfunctional environments tend to stay in active addiction longer, perhaps in part because we developed a high tolerance for chaos and crisis. A high tolerance for chaos does not translate into an enhanced ability to successfully handle it. In fact, it more often indicates the opposite. Recovery can help overcome the deficits of our childhood. Certainly, we should include an assessment of the effects of a dysfunctional childhood and/or early use as part of our step work. But as we work through this history, it is wise to be cautious and to give the process plenty of time. We should avoid creating an additional burden and source of stress during early recovery by reopening the wounds of an abusive or traumatic past. We should also avoid such counterproductive reactions as blame, resentment, or a victim mentality. We will discuss this further in upcoming chapters. Regardless of personal history, the 12-step approach is a potentially useful strategy to help us build functionality and behavioral success in our lives. This strategy, combined with the support of a network, can assist addicts who need to work past the damage and deficits of the less than ideal childhood so that they can live more functionally from the point of recovery onward. This is truly a second chance at life. Characteristics and stages of addiction progression. Below, I've attempted to describe the traits and patterns that tend to be characteristic of a generalized progression through early, middle, and late addiction. I'll briefly mention an initial use phase in this paragraph. Initial use consists of discovery and early experimentation, perhaps with alcohol and/or marijuana. In general, these two drugs enjoy widespread social acceptance and availability. In our initial experiences, we discover, on both a conscious and subconscious level, that psychoactive drugs consistently deliver a high when used. They teach us that when it comes to feeling good, alcohol and drugs are a sure thing. Even among those who proceed from experimentation to regular use, which can include occasional binge use, it may be difficult to distinguish who will or will not progress to full-blown addiction. Many young people grow out of partying phase, perhaps after a negative consequence, or perhaps in response to taking on adult responsibilities. Either way, they go on to become moderate users or non-users. Other users progress from initial use into regular but controlled use. They have a daily or nearly daily pattern of substance abuse. through which they seem to cope or rather escape from the challenges of life by being high most of the time. Although this early phase of addiction, as described below, is a gray area characterized by regular and or serious binge use, these patterns are potentially reversible without extensive recovery efforts. If a person proceeds to the mid-phase of addiction, they cross the line from this potentially rescindable state into a clearly established pathology. A physical reprogramming of their brain and behavior occurs in the transition. Early phase of addiction, problematic substance use. This is characterized by frequency of drug use indicates the person is a regular user, getting high as a priority. Tolerance is developing. More of the drug is necessary to get the desired level of effect. Drug use becomes a coping mechanism for stress. Social patterns change and begin to revolve around use. Social circle is mostly fellow users. Negative consequences have occurred, perhaps one or two serious ones. User tends to trivialize consequences and rationalize continued or excessive use. Mature personality traits start to give way to more impulsive, emotionally reactive, or withdrawn behaviors. User starts to neglect planning for the future. Denial of pragmatic use develops. So now we're in the mid-phase of addiction, dependency and established addictive reprogramming. These are the characteristics. A very strong urge or craving for drugs and alcohol exists. User experiences an inability to stop drinking or use once they have started, a very pronounced trait in alcoholism. Physical dependence causes onset of withdrawal symptoms, shakiness, nausea, and sweating, etc. Very pronounced trait with opioids. Tolerance for drug, alcohol increases. Normal activities lose priority. Relationships, work, and other normal areas of life suffer. User is self-centered even during critical times when others depend on them. User begins to use or drink alone, hides alcohol or drugs. Negative consequences occur, but are followed by denial, rationalization, and more use to cope with the stress of consequences. Addictive cycle is now evident in daily or nearly daily use. User may or may not be aware of this cycle, rationalizes behavior, and may or may not be aware of their inability to stop. A crisis has probably occurred in at least one important area of the user's life: finance and work, relationship, physical or psychological health. User engages in high-risk behavior, morals decay. User tries to moderate or quit, but these attempts ultimately fail. These mid-phase characteristics are important to consider in interventions and assessments, including self-assessments, used in the first and fourth steps, as they can help an addict who has not progressed to late stages start the recovery process at an earlier time point, rather than waiting to hit a low bottom or a point of extreme crisis. Effective assessments cut through the denial and rationalizations and may even allow a mid-stage user to reach the necessary conclusions to successfully begin their recovery process. Getting high becomes the number one coping mechanism by mid-phase. Stress is an especially powerful trigger because drugs, in the short run, are such an effective feel-good coping mechanism. The deeper we sink into our addiction, the more likely we are to use drugs to deal with the stress of negative consequences of our use. Chronic pain, either from physical or psychological trauma, is also a very relevant reason to use drugs as a coping mechanism. The problem is that before long, addiction is even treating addiction with more addiction. Yes, it is easy to see that this coping mechanism will eventually come to a high price. And by the end of this phase, addiction not only worsens existing problems by repeatedly allowing us to escape and ignore them, it also inevitably creates new problems. At the same time, we lose our ability to learn from experience. We then sink further into reliance on a drug-induced inner reality rather than face the real reality. No wonder that when we finally hit rock bottom, it will look, sound, and feel like we have sunk into insanity. So, late phase addiction, crisis upon crisis, and these are the characteristics. The costs far outweigh the rewards. User may not be completely aware of this fact because of well-developed denial and rationalization. There is a pattern of crisis after crisis in multiple areas of the user's life. Using or drinking appears to be the go-to coping mechanism. User easily lowers moral standards, especially to provide means and opportunity to use. User constantly manipulates those closest to them. They are obviously adverse effects to physical and psychological health. User frequently uses alone or with one or a few other heavy users. Family and former friends no longer communicate with the user, except possibly a few who are codependent or fellow users. User seems incapable of honesty with others and with themselves, rarely takes responsibility for actions. Multiple attempts to moderate, quit have failed. User may be headed for bottom, where they realize they can't continue to drink or use any longer, but they haven't the power to stop. Negative consequences are now equal to the motivational force of addictive drive, which means getting high is no longer pleasurable, nor is it optional. User may have recently experienced the intervention of a power greater than self, such as incarceration, bankruptcy, hospitalization, homelessness, crushing isolation, and psychological collapse, etc. If user hasn't been arrested or suffered significant physical injury yet, they're overdue. User may be suicidal. Addiction is rather black and white at this point, and this is the stage when the addict will one day realize they are no longer a willing participant. The decision to seek help comes about as we lose the battle of reward versus consequences. When addicts hit bottom, the negative consequences are becoming painful enough to create a growing desire to avoid the aftermath. However, we lack the willpower to follow through on that desire to stop. Crisis continues to build, and the conflicted addict unable to end use Crisis continues to build, and the conflicted addict, unable to end use, yet no longer able to escape into it, becomes quite miserable. Good. If the misery can break through the defenses of denial and rationalization and pride, then the addict may ask for help and shift the tide toward recovery. And that is chapter 3, which again was all about the characteristics of addiction addicts. So we'll continue on now to chapter 4, overview of secular recovery. So that's going to be exciting to start. Again, with the psychological aspect, the biological stuff, I find this all very important for us to know, especially as in the recovery community, to be familiar and aware with this stuff, because this is what's happened to us, but it's also what's happening to others, especially as people are coming in. It gives us just more foundation for how to help people, and I think that is really important. And his stuff about growing up, he's hitting the nail on the head there for me in a lot of ways with maturing and growing out of the childhood behaviors that we got left in. Anyways, so now for prayer to know. Granted to me, higher power, to know that which is worth knowing, to love that which is worth loving, to praise that which pleases you most, to work for that which helps others. Granted to me, to distinguish with true judgment things that differ, and above all to search out and to do what is most pleasing to you. So as always, please leave any comments, questions, or thoughts, and I hope you have a blessed day. Thank you.